My name's Ed Piskor,
I'm Jim Rugg.
and today, guest of Cartoonist Kayfabe, we have, and this is not hyperbole, and do not be humble about this, Frederik Schodt, but we have the guy who introduced manga to America with books like Manga, The World of Japanese Comics, Dreamland Japan, Frederik L. Schodt. Welcome, sir.
It's an honor to be here. When I hear "sir," I think you must be addressing somebody. I am here, and it's an honor to meet you guys. I love your show, and I love your enthusiasm and the way you present things. It's great.
I've been wanting to talk to you for about 26, 27 years. So
Well, that's when I was born. So that.
I think for the uninitiated cartoonist kayfabe viewer out there, can you give us just a little bit introduction of your humble origins in this manga comic book game? Would you have seen anime like Astro Boy or Kimba the White Lion before you saw manga? Did you have some idea of like what are these big-eyed characters?
It's interesting because I went to Japan from Australia and I was 15, almost 16, so this was like 1965. And obviously I didn't read Japanese at all when I first arrived, and I couldn't speak it either. But I remember on the TV, they were still showing Tetsuan Atom or Astro Boy, and I would sometimes watch that. Of course, I wouldn't understand what they're talking about, but I enjoyed it. And then there was also Astro Boy or Atom had already been out in Japan for a couple of years, so there was another show that was even more popular, and that was Obake no Kyutaro, which is not really known in the United States, but it was kind of like this Casper the Ghost story about these friendly ghosts. And that was a huge hit when I arrived in Japan, and I remember going to like temple fairs and fairs in the neighborhood where we lived in Tokyo, and the little kids, especially the girls, would often have their hair tied in a little band on top of their heads, and so their hair would stick up because Obake no Kyutaro, he had these three like sort of hairs on top of his head, which was sort of the cartoonist's motif.
Is this
And it was just hugely popular at the time. So everywhere you go, you'd see these little Kyutaro dolls and kids dressed up. They were so cute, like Kyutaro.
Now I'm gonna butcher every Japanese word and name, but Kitaro, is that Shigeru Mizuki's Kitaro? Is that what you're saying?
No. This is
Okay.
It was by at the time it was known as a duo, Fujio, and they were two people with one name, and then later on they split up, and I don't remember exactly how the rights to Kyutaro were appropriated, but it wasn't Taro, but it was Kyutaro, so it was with a Q, and it was actually written with a Q, Kyutaro, and the Taro is a common name in Japan, first name in Japan, and then the Q was just it was the Roman alphabet. But it was just hugely popular, and for whatever reason, it's never really been exposed in the United States. I don't know why. But those are the two shows on TV that I remember, and I don't remember much about manga at all. And I lived in Japan 3 times, and the first time I was there, obviously in the beginning I didn't know Japanese, and I don't even remember, to tell you the truth, seeing a lot of people reading manga. Which is interesting to me in retrospect, but I think it's not only because I couldn't read Japanese and I didn't understand Japanese in the beginning, but I think it's also because manga had not really diffused into the older age groups so much. So kids in high school and college were not really reading them as much as they would later. So they were still regarded as something for smaller kids. And since I was in high school, in an international school, most of the people I know, whether they were Japanese friends or American friends, they didn't want to be thought of as reading comics at that point in history. But so everything changed later. And when I went back and I was living in Japan in 1970, then college students were reading manga all over the place, and they were kind of a badge of pride. So it's sort of like the rock and roll movement in the United States. It became sort of a symbol of youth culture. And you had college students walking around with these giant weekly magazines that were designed for, 12 and 13-year-olds and being proud of it. So it's a totally different world.
It's interesting because we sort of had that a little bit with the early Kirby Stanley Marvel, where college kids were sort of considered hip to be down with a Ditko Doctor Strange comic or whatever.
Yeah. I think it is similar. And also, similar to the sort of whole youth culture, rock and roll movement in the United States, then in America you also had, a little bit later, you had, underground comics, which are a real badge of pride for people in their 20s especially.
Yeah, especially in the Bay Area where you're at right this minute, man, the epicenter of the American underground comic.
Zap Comics, that's right.
When you go back, Frederik, in like 1970, I think you said, that's about a 5-year range from the first time you were there and comics aren't that big. And then you get back there in 1970 and now they have infiltrated colleges. Is there something that you can point to as like what that, what causes that change?
Garo?
Garo has a lot to do with it, but it was also part of basically this youth culture. They had a huge baby boom in Japan, just as they did in the United States and still do. And there were a lot of parallels around the world. I think you saw not only, anti-war demonstrations and Japan, huge demonstrations against the war and against the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. And then in France, you had the same thing. In '68, there's the whole movement in France. And then in the United States, you had the student movement. And I think that it was a way to just assert youth culture. And people could say they were reading works that were originally designed for 12 and 13-year-olds and kind of brag about it and enjoy it. And then there were also, parallel to that, was this emergence in Japan of somewhat similar to underground comics in the United States, but works like Garo, which was a magazine that featured these avant-garde artists. And those, of course, were designed for adults. And I mean, when I say adults, I'm saying that loosely, anything from, 17 to probably 27 at that point, or something like that. But there were a lot of these very politicized avant-garde manga appearing then, and that they were enormously popular and influential among college students, and especially the works of Shirato Sanpei.
Yes.
Who did Ninja Bugecho, or Chronicles of Ninja. Those works were sort of a Bible of many college students because they fit in with the student movement and with the kind of Marxist worldview that was very popular then.
Manga is a calling to you, and I wonder, when did you get ravenous about this medium?
Well, I was back in Japan, as I mentioned, in 1970. I sort of had to escape from the United States, I guess. But I was a junior in university, and I went back to Japan because I was in California, in Santa Barbara, and I was trying to figure out what to do and what to study and what to major in. And I became an Asian studies major. And since I lived in Japan before, and there were aspects of the culture and the life there that were really intriguing to me, I really wanted to focus on learning the language. And I also needed to get away from we had a lot of unrest in Santa Barbara, in Isla Vista. At that time, it was one of the worst places in the U.S. to be, although it was not reported on heavily because the media were banned from the town. But anyway, I wound up going back to Japan and going to university in Japan, in Tokyo, and I was involved in this intensive Japanese course, which was 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and then, of course, on top of that, you had to study. So it was just a super intensive language program, and obviously I needed some relaxation, and I also had always enjoyed comics, so I started reading Japanese comics. And in the very beginning, I only read the ones that I could kind of understand because I was still learning the language. But I became totally hooked on using manga as a way for me to further my language skills. But it also became sort of a window into Japanese culture, into the sort of deep Japanese culture that you really can't experience unless you live there and you sort of semi-integrate into society. And the manga were just a wonderful, as I said, window for me onto this other world. It's like, in one of my books, I think I used the word, it's like the Japanese id. It's like this view into the Japanese id. And then some of the works that I read, and I started reading them in weekly magazines. These were magazines mainly for 12, 13-year-old boys that the university students were reading then. And I just became hooked on some of the series. And then a friend of mine, a good friend, Okada Shuichi, he introduced me to The Phoenix by Tezuka, Osamu Tezuka. And he loaned me a couple copies, and he said, you just make sure you return these. And it was almost like he was handing me the Bible or the Koran or something. And it's like, you read this and make sure you give it back. And I just became totally amazed by The Phoenix. I'd never seen anything like that done in comics before. And I became a huge fan of The Phoenix. And from there, it just, escalated. And then it wasn't until much later, actually, until 1977 that I was living in Japan another time, the last time. And then I became interested in the idea of translating manga. But that's kind of the ramp up for me anyway.
Yeah, I think that's the next step, is what makes you start to think about writing a book on this subject?
I was living in Japan. I guess I went back, because I went back and forth, and I'd been in LA for a while, working in LA, actually as a tour guide for Japanese, taking people not only to LA, but Canada and Mexico and whatnot. And then I went back to Japan to study interpreting and translation. And then when I finished that program, I was working as a professional translator. And I had a very good friend who was also in Tokyo. His name was Jared Cook. And he was in the university that I had been in. He was still studying as a postgraduate student, I guess. And then he and a Japanese friend named Shinji Sakamoto, or Sakamoto Shinji, they approached me, and we started talking about manga, and somehow the subject of creating a group to translate manga came up. And in the very beginning, there was another woman, Midori Ueda Midori, who was with us, but she wasn't with us very long. And we formed this group called Dadakai. And we decided to try and translate Japanese manga, but we really didn't have any, we didn't really know how to do it because we didn't have any prior examples that we knew of it, at least. And we decided, well, what we had to discuss what will we start with, and we were all fans of Tezuka's Phoenix. So that was one work that we began translating, and we also began translating works by Matsumoto Reiji. And those translation attempts were never published. Actually, the translation of the Phoenix collected dust in the archives in Tezuka Productions for 25 years until it was finally published by Viz Media. And then Jared and I, independent of Dadakai, we translated the rest of the volumes because we had originally only done 5 volumes. And then, but because when we were doing the translation, it very quickly became apparent to me that it was really too early to get works published. That first of all, I thought maybe it's necessary to have a book that sort of introduces and puts manga in a cultural context and shows what an interesting social phenomenon and also interesting visual media that comics had become in Japan. So that's how I thought of writing manga. And I had a friend in Peter Goodman, who was also in Tokyo at the time, and he was starting to work as an editor at a couple Japanese publishers who specialized in English language books, and I gave him a proposal, and then a couple of years later, then that was finally accepted at Kodansha International. But in the beginning, I think there was actually some resistance to it because it was regarded as a little bit sort of edgy for them, I think. But that's how I came to write the book. The book was an attempt to just introduce to people outside of Japan this manga culture, because we realized very quickly, I think, that it was too difficult to get anything published in English at that point.
Kodansha International, was the Manga World of Japanese Comics book the first book that they had on our shores, or did they publish other kinds of stuff that we don't know about?
Well, they published all kinds of stuff. They were a Tokyo-based outfit, and actually they went out of business, I forget how many years ago, but it was a huge mistake to close it down in terms of Japan's future, because it was one of the few Japanese, it's a subsidiary of a giant publisher in Japan named Kodansha, which is also a big manga publisher.
Sure.
But they publish everything. And Kodansha International specialized just in English books that introduced Japan to the outside world, to English speakers. And they did a lot of very high quality books, but around 1980, 1983, almost all their books were on Japanese sort of official culture, or not official culture, but genuinely recognized, worthy of promotion kind of culture, like tea ceremony, and traditional arts and crafts, and also literature. They did literature as well, and a lot of wonderful Japanese novels from Kodansha International. And it really is a tragedy that the parent company closed them up, because it has harmed Japan, frankly. It's contributed to Japan's lowering of Japan's visibility in the world, frankly.
Now, the book is initially published in 1983, but there was that sort of famous sojourn or pilgrimage that the mangaka made to San Diego Comic-Con. That happens in like 80, 81, where Osamu Tezuka, Monkey Punch, and 30 other mangaka. Were you the liaison to help make that happen? And could you remember some of the names? Because in all the promotion, no names are mentioned except for Go Nagai, Monkey Punch, and Osamu Tezuka.
Yeah, I don't remember all of the names, but I was definitely involved in that. Because what happened is that I came back to the United States in 1978, and my friend Jared, who was also one of the founders of Dadakai in Tokyo, he also came back to Japan shortly after that. And Jared and I would work for Tezuka, and this was separate from Dadakai, but we would work for Tezuka and help him out in a variety of ways. We were consultants on the animation Phoenix 2772 or Space Firebird 2772. And we also helped Tezuka out when he would come to the United States. And I can't remember, a lot of the details on the trip that Tezuka made to San Diego Comic Convention, because actually he came several times, and either Jared or I would usually act as the interpreter or the coordinator. And if I was busy, then Jared would do it, or if he were busy, then I would try and do it. And as a result, I worked with Tezuka several times when he came not only to San Diego, but LA. And then I also went with him to Canada, and I went around the United States with him. He had a speaking junket where he even spoke at the UN. And of course, that looked really great in the Japanese media, but it wasn't quite at the UN General Assembly at all. It was actually in a relatively medium-sized room with mainly Japanese expats and people working in Japanese corporations who attended. But it sounded great in the Japanese. And San Diego, I think I may have gone there more than once, so I'm a little fuzzy on all the details. But I remember being there with Tezuka, and both Jared and I were were there, I think, when he won the Inkpot Award. And we coordinated for him and interpreted for him multiple times in California. I think that compared to their visibility in Japan, their visibility in the United States was almost nil. I don't remember any specific, episodes like that. I think Toriyama and so forth. It was too early in a little bit early in their careers for them to be on the same level as Tezuka or even Monkey Punch. They were much better. They were very established, and even Go Nagai was very established in Japan at that point. But there were a lot of, most of the time I was running around, and Jared, we were running around trying to make sure that everything was going right and that everybody was happy. And I just remember, having to do a lot of interpreting, and there were a lot of people there. That's the thing I remember. A lot of people.
While we're talking about Tezuka, for anybody watching this at home, the god of comics, he's been compared to Walt Disney and Jack Kirby. It seems like as big as there is for a mangaka. Do you have any anecdotes, any fun stories about him, Frederik? You worked with him, and I mean, from our vantage point, this is a legend. So, any stories you can share about working with him?
Yeah, I was actually just in Japan a few weeks ago, actually 4 weeks ago, I guess, and I'm on the executive committee of the International Manga Award, which is run by the Foreign Ministry in Japan, and they have the reception after the award ceremony. And a friend of mine, Taku Furukawa, came up to me, and I hadn't seen him for, I think, 40 years, and he actually went with us to Canada to a film festival once with Tezuka, and he reminded me of this story, which I think I wrote about in one of my books or mentioned it, but Tezuka and his retinue or his entourage, they were on their way to Canada, and I was meeting them in San Francisco, and then I was going to go from San Francisco to Canada with them. And Taku reminded me that, we were sitting in the airport. They had gotten off their plane from Japan, and we were waiting to get on the plane to go to Canada. And we were sitting in the lobby, in the boarding area, and I was talking with Tezuka. And whenever I talked with Tezuka, I tended to have these deep discussions about all kinds of things, because he was just such a fascinating person. And he I think because I'm fluent in Japanese, so I think he enjoyed talking with me, and he was just this intensely curious person. He's curious about everything. So, we would be talking about, nuclear fusion, or, what do Americans think about this or that, or, German literature or whatever. And I became so absorbed in talking with Tezuka that the plane that we were supposed to get on board and fly to Canada, it landed, and everyone in the boarding area who was going to get on the plane got on the plane, and the plane took off. I didn't notice. And I guess none of the other Japanese people who were with us, which included Taku Furukawa, whom I just met a few weeks ago, and Suzuki Shinichi, who's a famous Japanese animator and a close friend of Tezuka, they didn't notice either, maybe because they didn't speak enough English. I don't know what happened, but I had to, apologize deeply. And in normal context, I probably would have had to commit suicide right there. Tezuka was just, he never got angry at me, which was, in retrospect, was always amazing. And he was completely cool about it. And I was able to get us another flight, and we got on board, and everything worked out okay. But that's one episode that really sticks in my mind. As I mentioned, I was reminded of this by Taku Furukawa, and he said, "I'm going to get together with people, and I'm I'm going to do a podcast about this. That was so embarrassing.
How'd you meet Tezuka? That seems like a big step from having some interest in manga and then getting to hang out with, the god of manga.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when I was in Tokyo and when I was working with this small group, Dadakai, and we were translating, the first work that we decided to translate was Tezuka's Phoenix. And we didn't know any better, really, because we were young and stupid and all that sort of thing. And we just thought, well, maybe we could just contact him. And Shinji Sakamoto, who was another member of Dadakai, he somehow got some connection, I think through his brother, I'm not sure. But somehow we were able to contact Tezuka Productions and get a meeting with Matsutani Takayuki, who was Tezuka's manager at that time. And so we went to Tezuka Productions, which is it actually still is in Takadanobaba in Tokyo. And I remember we walked in and we were talking with Tezuka, not with Tezuka, with Mr. Matsutani about the possibility of translating the Phoenix. And while we were there, lo and behold, Tezuka just materialized, and he was interested in talking to us. And I think probably it was such a novel idea at that time that anyone would want to translate the Phoenix that badly, that he had actually emerged from his, normally he would be working away drawing all the time. And he seemed to enjoy just meeting us and talking with us. And that was the beginning of a long association that involved, both translation and interpreting and, all kinds of things for the company and for Tezuka himself. So until he died, I had and Jared also, my friend Jared Cook, we had quite a long relationship with him, and close relationship with him.
You mentioned how, his natural curiosity. Was he looking at any American comics? Was that any part of your relationship with him, interpreting American comics that he was interested in?
Yes. When we first met him, we didn't have access to very many American comics, but after I came back to the States, I would regularly send him works from the United States. He admired Robert Crumb, and I also sent him other comic books that he had heard about. And artists, around the world, I think, are always interested in what other artists are doing. And someone like Tezuka was interested in, of course, he was interested in everything, but he was particularly interested in what other artists were doing. And he was quite good friends with foreign artists as well. So, for example, he knew Mobius, Girard, the French
sure.
Yes. Yeah, quite well. And I actually interpreted once a meeting with Tezuka and Mobius in Century City in LA, and I remember that. So he was fascinated by what other artists were doing, and not only manga artists and comic artists, but underground artists, but also animators. And he had very good relations with a lot of very notable people around the world.
So the first, I guess the first real translated manga in English was excerpts from Barefoot Gen, and I Saw It. Did you have something to do with either of those to begin with?
I was involved with Project Gen in the sense that I became a member of Project Gen, and Jared and I translated the second volume of the series. And when we were in Tokyo and working on Tezuka's Phoenix as Dadakai, there was this parallel group, many of whom were friends of mine, called Project Gen, and these were volunteers. They were Japanese and Americans. It was a fairly large group, and they were working on a volunteer basis to translate Keiji Nakazawa's Barefoot Gen or Hadashi no Gen and introduce it to the outside world. And it was part of an anti-nuclear movement. So I became involved in that. And as I said, Jared and we did the second volume. And originally it was done by many, I think the first volume was actually many people were involved in it, and they needed to get out the second volume in more of a hurry. So they turned to us because we already had experience doing this. So that was my involvement. And I was sort of peripherally involved in Project Gen for many, many years. My friend Alan Gleason became the Project Gen representative in the United States. And then Leonard Reifus, who was the publisher of Educomics in San Francisco, he was sort of loosely affiliated with the underground comics movement. He put out, in the very beginning, he tried to put out an American comic version of Barefoot Gen, because the original publication was done in Japanese style, and it was very difficult to get it into comic specialty stores or into in any kind of comics distribution in the United States. So he tried to localize it and initially published it in American format as, I think, maybe 40-page long, black and white, but done flopped and lettered in American comic book style, and it was called Gen of Hiroshima.
Yes.
And then he realized that if you were going to publish the work in American comic book style, that it would probably take him the rest of his life and more to put out the whole story, because of course it's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. So then he looked for another work that would be more amenable, but had the same spirit, and he hit upon the idea of doing a shorter work by Keiji Nakazawa, which is actually even more autobiographical.
Yes.
And I think even better done than Barefoot Gen. And that was called, in English, was called I Saw It. And that was not only flopped, but professionally lettered, but colorized. And I didn't do the translation, but I think I did some of the sound effects. And some of the lettering for the sound effects. And I also I really pushed Leonard on this to go big, because he had this opportunity to get a good deal printing it in color, and I thought, having it in color, that would really help in the United States. And I don't think Leonard forgave me for a long time, because he had something like $40,000 copies of I Saw It sitting in his garage until recently. So it was ahead of its time as well, but I thought it was very well done, and that was also part of my involvement with Project Gen, which was really politically motivated more than anything else.
So getting back to Manga, it seems like this is about similar time frame. What were some of the challenges that you faced writing this book?
Well, there were a lot of them. It was a somewhat painful experience in the very beginning, because it was hard initially to get a contract. I think there was some resistance in Japan to maybe in the publisher to having a book on manga. It was a little bit edgier than anything they'd done. It took a long time to wrap up an agreement with the publisher, and there were some painful parts of that for me. In the beginning, they didn't want to, give copyright or anything like that.
Wow.
And the royalty rate was vastly less than I had originally thought it should be. But then there was also just the logistics. I went to Japan many times and stayed there a long time, and I had to run around and collect all these images and interview people and read a ton. It was really a full steam ahead project that I wouldn't be able to do today. And in addition to the writing, of course, and selecting the illustrations, there was, in the back, as you know, there are these 4 excerpts from manga that are translated into English. And for me, one of the big challenges was to figure out how to sort of pretend like I could be a professional comics letterer, which I'm not. But I had to learn how to do lettering, and I had to learn how to do a lot of things. So, I created the format for those works of flopping them and sometimes rearranging the panels and doing the lettering and also the titles in the works and so forth. So I really worked hard at that.
It's incredible.
People were very nice to me. Leonard Reifus, who was running Edu Comics at that time, which was also, and he was also putting out Keiji Nakazawa's I Saw It and also Geno Hiroshima. He helped teach me how to do lettering using there are these, I forget what it's called. You guys probably know it much better than I do.
The Ames Lettering Guide.
That's right, Ames Lettering Guide. and using the right pens and whatnot. And my neighbor, taught me various fonts and that sort of thing. So, people were very helpful. And in those days, the nice thing is that unlike today, most Japanese artists were just thrilled at the idea of being interviewed and thrilled at the idea that, say, one little panel from their work might be introduced to, a foreign audience. I mean, they were just overjoyed, and everybody was very cooperative and very helpful. And more than anything else, I was aided by the fact that Tezuka was very behind this work, and he wound up writing the foreword or the introduction. And in those days in Japan, if you had Tezuka's support, that opened up just about all the doors to almost all artists. And it was really quite extraordinary. And then the other thing that helped me is that Kodansha, which is a huge publisher in Japan, even though I was working with this tiny subsidiary of them, the name made people feel more, I guess, at ease and relaxed. And many of them, of course, had had very little contact with foreigners. So for them, just meeting a foreigner and being asked questions about manga was just such a novel idea that it was a little scary at the same time. So they could feel a little bit more relieved that not only was the publisher a well-known, or the parent of the publisher was this place that everybody knew, and then also that they knew that Tezuka approved of what I was doing. So that really, really helped me. And I met fascinating people because I interviewed all sorts of people, political cartoonists and also cartoonists from World War II and pre-World War II and, all kinds of genres. And it was a fascinating experience for me. It changed my life, I should say.
I think it changed a lot of lives. One of the most remarkable things to me, I probably encountered this book about 20 years ago for the first time. It feels as relevant and accurate today as it must have felt in 1983, which is, that's surprising. I feel like a lot, especially a first work of this sort, a big survey of manga, I would expect you to get things wrong and to miss things, and it just feels very accurate, very comprehensive, and very relevant even today.
Oh, thank you. I think, though, that there's one area where I really missed the boat, which is in the first edition. I think that I wrote at the end that the obstacles to Japanese manga becoming accepted overseas were huge, and that as a result they would probably never become very popular. And I listed some of the obstacles, like the cultural references and also the different direction of reading, left to right or right to left, that kind of thing. And that was completely wrong. I had no idea at the time that Japanese comics would become as popular as they have been in the United States. And I certainly had no idea that in the future, that maybe, well, it was 1983, so about 18 years later, that young Americans would start to demand that their manga not be flopped and that they be read from right to left instead of left to right. That I had no idea that Americans were that flexible, and I still am amazed by it. And that's just the most amazing thing. And I think I actually rewrote part of that section when the later edition came out. But I was way off target there.
The edition that we have retained that piece, and I found it to be I found it to be beautiful, like very quaint, because you got so much right. You know what I mean? Like throughout the full book, you got so much right, and just like as a snapshot of that exact moment in time, I think if you projected me and Jim back to 1983, and you asked us if a regular old American is gonna put up with reading a book backwards and all this kind of thing, we would probably come to the exact same conclusions as you.
And quite frankly, we were reading comics through late 80s and 90s, and it did take a long time for that change to happen and be accepted. There was a lot of comics fans in the U.S. that weren't interested in manga, and I don't think would have accepted unflipped manga. It was hard enough to sell it with a lot of attention and commitment from the publishers that were bringing that here, and it still took a generation of readers to embrace it. So I can understand where you were coming from at the time, and I'm thrilled that has proven to be maybe one piece that you did get a little bit wrong. But
yeah, I'm very happy. I'm amazed at the flexibility of Americans. I never would have dreamed. Of course, a lot of fans, unfortunately, they don't know exactly how that all transpired, because it's not always the way people think it transpired. But
set the record straight.
Fill us in.
But to go back to another example of one of the obstacles in creating manga was the title. I was afraid that using the word manga in the main title would cause the book to be logged in American card catalogs in libraries next to manganese. Or that people would think it's an Italian word, meaning, eat, manga. But my editor at the time, Peter Goodman, he said, no, we got to use this word manga. And at first I was against this idea, and I thought that it won't help the book at all. But we eventually settled on it, and that was struck with luck. Originally, the title was Japanese Comics: A New Visual Culture. That was the one that I had used, and then it became Manga, the World of Japanese Comics. But to get back to, I think, what you were interested in, which is the flopping versus non-flopping issue. There's a lot of sort of manga otaku in America who think that reading Japanese manga from right to left is more authentic than reading it from left to right, and therefore they didn't want their manga flopped. There were all these issues of, in the beginning, of course, you had to flop manga or nobody would read, and the average American would never read from right to left instead of left to right. But in terms of authenticity, one thing that a lot of the fans and a lot of the otaku fans, I should say, misunderstand is that part of the transition from flopping to non-flopping came about because of the fact that artists in Japan had become extremely powerful by the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. And I think actually Toriyama Akira was one of the first. And many of the artists did not want their work flopped because as an artist, and I'm sure you guys are very aware of this, if you flop your work, often some of the errors are much more visible. And for artists who are particular about this was a major issue. And for many Japanese artists, the idea that all the characters would become left-handed was an issue, because in Japan, traditionally, there were very few left-handers. Left-handed people were discouraged from being left-handed, and they became basically forced to become right-handed in school and so forth. So the idea for artists that all their characters would suddenly become left-handed, it was just unthinkable. And then the other thing was that in samurai comics, the idea that the samurai would be holding a sword in the left hand, that was also unthinkable. And then costumes, like the way the kimono would button or the way shirts would button, fold over right over left, that was also unthinkable. So for artists, there was this big resistance from the beginning to having their work flopped, and they just went along with it because they really had no choice. And then when they became so powerful, then they could start selling American publishers like Viz and others that didn't want their works flopped. And if you don't, if you insist on flopping, I won't give you the rights to publishing the work. And then there were other issues involved, which involved money, because for publishers, not flopping manga, it saves a lot of money. You don't have to go through, in the beginning, before everything went digital, they used, in Japanese it's called kamiyaki, but it's stats. So it was expensive. You had to photograph the page and then you had to flop it, and people would get these large stats that were blown up and then reversed, and then you do your lettering on top of that. And so it was very expensive, not only in the production process, but it was time consuming. So for publishers, none of them thought, and when I say none of them, I mean maybe like Viz and First Comics and others, they didn't think that comics would work in the United States unless they were flopped and made to look just like American comics. So that's why, for example, Otomo Katsuhiro's Akira in the beginning was actually colorized and became very dark, and I think it was a terrible mistake to colorize it. But there was this belief that you had to look as much like an American comic as possible, or it wouldn't sell. But the irony of it is that today, even though people think they're reading a much more authentic Japanese comic book, it's really a hybrid. Because if you're reading from right to left, in other words, if the pages are not flopped, you're reading the way Japanese readers do, from the top right to the left bottom of the page, and you're turning the pages from the right to the left, so it's the reverse of the normal American order. But within the word balloons, you're reading from left to right.
Right.
And Japanese people do not read from left to right in the balloons horizontally. Manga, the vast majority of manga, are always written from right to left vertically. Japanese is, you read from top right to left bottom. So what you have now outside of Japan in non-flop manga are really a hybrid. And most people are not aware of this, and they're not aware of the reasons that actually the transition occurred. Many people think that it's just because, well, they're more authentic, but it's not simple at all. It's much more complicated.
So maybe the next place to go is, what's the reception of manga
Yes.
when it's published and released?
In the States in particular.
It was great, and it was a surprise. I've written a lot of books at this point, but nothing came out of the gate with as much attention as manga. And I think the reason is that it just took Americans totally by surprise. People had no idea that was Japan. To me, that was the real Japan. What you see in manga, that was always the real Japan. But I think most people were so focused on arts and crafts, traditional arts and crafts of Japan, Zen, and of course in the beginning of the 80s, people were reading books about quality control and business management, and suddenly they realized, well, whoa, there's this whole popular culture thing in Japan. We didn't know Japan had any popular culture. We didn't know Japanese had a sense of humor. I think it just took people by surprise. So there were reviews all over the world. It was amazing, and even the New Yorker reviewed it. And that's the only book of mine that's ever gotten that kind of broad reviews without having to do a lot of work on it.
So after the reception of manga, it goes over here in the States. How long after do translated manga start to appear here in this country? Well,
just when manga came out, my friend Leonard Reifus was also issuing, the translation of Barefoot Again as Gen of Hiroshima in American comic book style.
Right.
And then also I Saw It. So those are some of the first works. And then, shortly, well, I guess several years after that, you have be 87, something like that. You had First Comics in putting out Lone Wolf and Cub, and then you had Viz Media putting out was it Area 88 and Kamui and some of the earlier works that they did.
Yeah, My the Psychic Girl. They did those 3 books, and they did them at first with Eclipse Comics. I think to kind of learn some of the ropes of the American, the direct market, I suppose, and then going off on their own.
Yeah, that's right. They started out with Eclipse Comics. That's right.
And these are West Coast businesses. Viz, Eclipse. I believe Eclipse was Cali.
Yeah.
And you're a Bay Area guy, so were you involved with them?
I wasn't involved with them, but I knew them. It's a small world.
Sure.
And I think that they may have seen things in manga that they found interesting, and they got interested in Japanese manga. I know Seiji Horiguchi quite well, and he was the head of Viz Comics when it was formed, and he came to my place before he started Viz, and he asked me about the idea of publishing Japanese manga. He said he was interested in publishing a Japanese manga, and at the time he was living in the neighborhood in Haight-Ashbury, and I remember he came over to my living room and we were just chatting away, and we had friends in common and some overlap in the somewhat hippie-esque background, I guess. And I remember he told me that he was interested in doing this, and he had some connections in Japan, and he thought maybe he could put together something. And I basically told him at that point, and it's like, good luck, It probably won't work. And I've always thought about that because, of course, he was very successful in working with manga. But I was kind of throwing cold water on his plans, and I said, wow, it's because I had seen what had happened with Educomics attempts and also with other publishing attempts to put out Japanese manga, and I wasn't encouraging at all. I said good luck. I just thought the obstacles were so big at that point. But nonetheless, he was successful. And as you said, he did work originally with Eclipse, and then they went on their own and did very well. So I knew Seiji quite well, and I knew Torrance Smith very well.
We can say Studio Proteus, Torrance Smith, who did a lot of. We would see that name on a lot of like Dark Horse comics. The manga they were bringing in.
Masamune Shiro, Appleseed. That was an Eclipse book back then.
Right. And in the very beginning, Torrance was actually working for Viz and for Seiji for a brief period.
So we're getting into kind of like late 80s, early 90s, and we're starting to see manga coming into the United States. What are you doing at this point, Frederik? Are you doing some translations? Are you working with any of these companies, directly or in work that we would have seen or could track down now?
I can't remember when I started doing translations for Torrance or Seiji, but it was fairly early, I think. I also work as an interpreter, so I've always had 3 careers really: writing my own books, translating things, and then the thing that's made most of the money for me has been interpreting. So they're all in the freezer right now, but
yeah, sure.
I always had this sort of complex, far left coast, 19th century kind of freelancer existence, kind of like you guys, I suppose,
Oh yeah, I was going to say it's becoming more of the norm, I think, for people to work this way. You're ahead of the curve.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think there were a lot more. It was easier to do that probably, 20, 30 years ago than today.
Well, what brings you back to Dreamland Japan? We should say your second manga book comes out in the late 90s. And again, astounding, highest recommendation for everybody watching from home. But what brings you back to this subject matter?
I think it came out actually in '96.
Yeah, 13 years
So
after Manga.
yeah, so I probably started working on it a few years before that. Um, I had been writing a column for the Mainichi newspaper, the Mainichi Daily newspaper, which was an English language newspaper issued in Tokyo, and I'd been writing a column on manga and interviewing manga artists. And actually, at one point, a friend of mine, Leonard Corin, and I were planning on bringing out a book mainly on Garo artists.
Mm.
And we even had a contract with Pantheon, which was a very famous company at one point. And then I forget exactly what year it was, but Pantheon imploded. There was a huge protest on the part of writers and editors, and everybody quit, and the whole thing just imploded. So everybody who had a contract with Pantheon and just went kaput. So that didn't work. But I think because of the column I'd been writing, and then also the work that I had thought about doing with Leonard, made me think, well, maybe I could put together a book that would be sort of a very different, but kind of a sequel to manga in the sense that it would be a book about modern Japanese manga and sort of more exotic manga. And that's how it came about.
Were there any specific big changes in the manga scene that you felt like this is something that you've got to chronicle? And I was thinking possibly otaku related or dojinshi related. Like those are two topics that I'm very interested in, and feel free to spin out and talk about either of those subjects. You know, they probably overlap and they're addressed in Dreamland Japan. But was that part of what drove you? Was that something you saw changing in the manga landscape?
Yeah, that was one thing, but also I think just the sophistication of the manga industry itself, because between 1983 and 1996, where I would have started working on the book probably 1993 or something like that, in that 10, 12-year period, the manga industry in Japan just exploded. I mean, it was just nuts. And I was fascinated by just the diversity of works that were being created, and also the new phenomenon, dojinshi, and just how manga had become so accepted in Japanese society, because at that point there were nearly 40% of all published material in Japan, and it's a real contrast to today as well. That was really when I created, or when I published Dreamland Japan, or when it was published by Stonebridge Press in 1996. That was really the peak of the Japanese manga industry, and I didn't know that at the time. But right around 96, 97, that's when publications peaked, and it's a very different world today. It would actually be great to write a new book about the manga business in Japan, because it's so changed.
Please do.
That's what we're here for today.
I don't think I will do this. Too much work.
This is all a ruse, Fred.
But the industry, of course, has changed so much. So in Dreamland Japan, I wanted to write about some of the more what I thought were interesting and sophisticated manga and remarkable manga, really, and artists who were doing just amazing things.
Fred, have you ever been to Comiket?
I didn't go through Comiket, but I went to what was at one time almost as big. It was called Super Comic City.
Is it dojinshi?
Yes. And I also interviewed, and I knew the people who organized Comiket quite well. And so even though I didn't attend Comiket, I am very familiar with what it's like, because at that time there were also many other dojinshi conventions almost as large, and it was just an extraordinary experience, kind of scary in a way.
Let's paint a picture for the audience who might not be aware, but a convention like Comiket, dojinshi is amateur produced comics and the audience is about 750,000. This is 3 times the size of San Diego Comic-Con, and none of these people are like Shonen Jump artists or Shonen Jump mangaka. These are amateur publications that exist in that period of time. Like, this is so different from what we have. Can you explain dojinshi phenomena? Like, is it illegal? It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating subculture, you might say, and of course it's even more diverse than you mentioned, because a lot of I'd say in the beginning it was mainly people creating amateur zines, amateurs creating amateur zines, and many of them were parodies of existing famous works. So people would take a story that they liked that was a commercially popular work, and then they would take the characters and have them in different situations, fall in love in different ways, and all kinds of things. And then it grew and grew and grew, and then even today you have all these different genres. So it's just this vast in scale, and there's an enormous amount of labor that goes into this. And it's totally different from an American comic book convention in the sense that these are not people who are selling back issues of comic books and trying to make money and recycle old issues of this and that. These are all, the vast majority of people are young, and they're creating manga on their own, they're creating zines on their own, and they're selling them in this sort of gray area in Japan where the copyright laws are not enforced as much as they are on the outside world. So you have a lot of parodies of famous works, things that would horrify probably, for example, Walt Disney, if they thought that there were hundreds of thousands of people doing parody works of Donald Duck and having Donald Duck doing the sort of things that they do in dojinshi comics, they wouldn't be able to hire enough lawyers. But it's a gray area in Japan where this is allowed, and there are some problematic areas to it. There's, as you know, because I think you guys have probably been to Comiket, but there are these subcultures within Comiket. There are people who specialize in boys' love, but there are also areas which are devoted to hentai manga, sort of, twisted, sexual, deviant manga. And I know that when I went, I was just so struck by not only the crowds, but I think the majority of the people probably are female who are creating the zines, but there's also, of course, a male component. And I remember wandering around these huge halls and the long lines of people, wanting to buy dojinshi, and many of the young women are dressed up in these, frilly dresses, and they've got all kinds of fragrances, and you walk through this jam-packed spaces, and it's just overwhelmingly, it's just an audio sensory experience. And then there's usually a corner where there's all these guys creating these hentai manga, and the smell is totally different. People haven't washed for a few days.
That's what all my people said.
It's so weird.
When I went to Japan for the first time last year, and went to the Mandarake in Akihabara, and just wandered into the dojinshi floor 4 or 5, and it was all middle-aged, like Japanese women, like reading, like it was almost all that the boys love stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, man, we're just not in Kansas anymore. Like, this is just different comics, And it was there was one bookshelf that had over 100 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle dojinshi that ladies were checking out, and it was only they were very respectful. Like, they didn't look at me like I was crazy, but I was the only guy on that floor, and I went there a few times, always the only dude.
Yeah, it's a completely different universe, and hard for Americans to imagine. If your image of comic book conventions is based on what you've seen at San Diego or other comic book conventions in America, it's almost impossible to imagine how different it is.
So Fred, is a festival like Comiket, is that a place where the dojinshi creator can be discovered and get work, or is it like they sell their 50 copies of, their Winter Soldier dojinshi, and then that's it. They're going back to medical school or something, after that November.
No, there are professionals who've emerged from the dojinshi market and done very well. And in fact, there are even professionals who have gone into the dojinshi market because at one point, of course, I think it's probably changed, but at one point it was a place where you could make a lot of cash if you were popular, and you could do the transactions under the table and not pay tax on them. I think that's changed, and even the dojinshi market may be experiencing new pressures as well. I'm not an expert on this. Den Kanemitsu, I don't know if you know him, but he's in Japan. He's an artist himself, and he's quite an expert on the dojinshi world. But there's been a real crackdown in Japan on piracy. So in the mainstream market now, there's been a lot of new ordinances passed locally and perhaps nationally to help Japan get in line with the rest of the world after there was some criticism from, I think, a UN body about Japan being a facilitator of child pornography and that sort of thing. So there's been a lot of crackdowns in Japan on the manga market in general, and there's been more pressure on the dojinshi market. But I think it's still regarded as a gray area where the laws that are perhaps applied on the outside are not applied in the dojinshi world to the same extent.
It's very fascinating. My friends told me about when you set up at Comiket, you are paying. They're very strict about the language, and you are an art exhibitor, and so it's not a commercial thing. And there's some language thing in Japan where the money transaction is formulated like it's a trade. So it's not a commercial transaction. It's like, well, I'm trading you these yen for this right here. It's amazing. And when I was over there were so many of those kind of like gray area outside of comics, just like all this kind of like gray zone languagey interaction where you could basically do anything you want.
Yeah. Well, Japan is a very interesting place in that regard because, as I'm sure you were aware when you were there, it's an extraordinarily structured society and very safe, and people are very law-abiding, but there are these huge areas where there's a gray area. And a lot of quasi-legal things are tolerated by the authorities. And in some ways, the safety aspect of Japan, and some people have made this comment, not necessarily true so much today, but the underworld in Japan has cooperated with the upper world in maintaining stability in Japanese society. And so it's a very different social organization than you might have in the United States.
How often do you go to Japan?
I go at least once a year. As I mentioned earlier, I'm on the executive committee for the International Manga Award. Technically speaking, I think it's now the Japan International Manga Award. And perhaps some of your listeners would be interested in it, because if you're an artist, it's a really great opportunity. And they don't provide any money for the award, but they bring you to Japan for 8 days, and they treat you really, really well. And if you're a winner, you get brought to Japan, and you get to meet Japanese artists, you get to meet other artists from around the world, and you get to tour in Japan. Usually they go to manga-related sites in Japan. They go to the Ghibli Museum, and they go down to Kyoto, and they visit the Kyoto Manga Museum. And sometimes they'll go to Takarazuka, which is near Osaka, to see the Tezuka Osamu museum. And it's just a wonderful program. I've been on the executive committee now for several years, and I actually won a special award. I think it was 2009 And it's a great award. It's not so well known in the United States. Actually, they get many more subscriptions, or not subscriptions, like submissions, I should say, from Asia and from Europe. And increasingly, they get submissions from even Africa, the Middle East, and South America. So this year, the winners were from Brazil, and also Spain, and Israel, and Thailand. So it's truly an international award. And if people are interested, if you go on the web and you look under Japan International Manga Award, you can find all the details, what's required to apply. But it's a great opportunity for people who want a little bit more exposure, and if they're interested in learning more about what's being done in Japan, and also seeing what other people around the world are doing in terms of comics culture.
I'll certainly put a link in the description below this video when it's live, so that people could check it out. But in terms of submissions, are they asking for like a one-shot, or?
It's varied over the years. At one point, it was kind of like there were a lot of very amateurish works that were submitted in the early years, but now it's become quite well known. So most of the works are very professional. Some of them are one-shot works, but some of them are also long works. There have been artists especially from Asia, who've done long works, many multi-volume works, and they submit, samples of their work, maybe hundreds of pages long, and then those are evaluated. They're translated into Japanese from languages all over the world by a group of translators.
Yeah, for sure.
Hello.
Hey, Fred.
Yeah. So that was on my side. I don't know why this happened, but I suddenly got this message. I've never seen it before. It said, we had run into a problem and we have to shut down. And then it rebooted. So I don't know what that was all about, but that was definitely on my side.
You're in Silicon Valley, man. There's a lot of bits and bytes flowing through that zip code.
Yeah, hopefully the world hasn't melted down or something like that. But I can still see outside. It's sunny. It looks great. So we're still here. We're alive.
Yeah, we ain't going to do Barefoot Fred.
So we may be getting kind of close to wrapping up. But I wanted to ask you, Fred, about Garo. You had mentioned it, and again, apologies for mispronouncing it. But you had mentioned that, that was possibly a book you were thinking about doing, and there's a lot of coverage in Dreamland Japan about Garo.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience with that, what it is, because I find it so interesting, as an alternative indie comics fan. I wonder if you could talk a little bit to our audience about what that book is and what your interest is in it, and maybe some outstanding artists from that.
Well, Garo was an alternative manga magazine, and it had a long history. I don't think it's being published anymore, or if it is, it's been resurrected, probably in a different format. But it was especially influential in the end of the 60s and during the 70s. And it attracted a lot of artists who were working on a totally different plane than commercial artists. It attracted a lot of artists who wanted to do something different, and often they weren't paid. I think usually they weren't paid. But a lot of fairly successful artists came out of the Garo zone, and they were good at finding artists who were just very eccentric, like Maruo Suehiro. Some of you may know, or you may know. And of course, they were quite revolutionary in the techniques they used and the stories that they told. So I was always interested in them, and in Dreamland Japan, I was able to focus on quite a few of them and interview many of them as well. Hanawa Kazuichi, for example, he was an artist who's fascinating to me. He lived up in Hokkaido, which is very unusual because most of the artists in Japan live in Tokyo and try and get published there. But Hanawa lived way up in Hokkaido, and he drew these bizarre stories, just totally bizarre stories, and otherworldly, sometimes set in the past, sometimes set in the present. And he wound up he had he was in jail for a while because in Japan they have very strict gun control, and he had been manufacturing a gun, as is sometimes done in Japan, and he was caught and thrown in jail, and he'd spent quite a bit of time in jail, and he wound up creating at least 2 or 3 books about his experiences in jail and after jail in manga format. So it was just obsessively detailed a depiction of what life is like in a Japanese prison. People like that, I just thought they were fascinating. They were very influential in the development of comics in Japan as well.
One of the interesting things about that book is the circulation numbers are so low compared to, I don't know, I guess the hit manga publications, and yet it seems to have had a big influence. So yeah. It's almost like a band in the U.S. or something, that's right. Nobody listened to, but everybody that went to the concert then started their own band or something,
The Ramones.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think more than the sales numbers, you'd have to get statistics on how many people actually read it, because the people who read it were probably far larger in number than the people who actually bought it. And that was a hallmark of Japanese manga in their heyday, I would say. The actual number of readers was vastly larger than the actual number of volumes sold, because people would share the books. And especially in university, people were sharing Garo. So the number of readers was probably much more than the actual sales. But it was never a really commercial magazine, and it was not designed to be so. The editor, he was kind of unique in that way. He was pursuing a different vision. And it was always struggling, always struggling, and went out of business a couple of times and was revived, but it had a huge influence.
When you go over to Japan, do you still accumulate a lot of books? Like, do you have your empty suitcase? Do you buy a lot of things? Do you go to Nakano Broadway Mall and?
No, I don't. I have a very good friend in Japan, and she sends me manga that she thinks are interesting. But I don't buy books because I don't have any room now for manga. I have too many manga. I have a garage full of manga, and I
want to see that so bad.
I think in far in the background you can probably see a bunch of the manga. I don't know, but depends where my camera is actually pointed here.
No, we see a fridge.
Oh, okay.
Have you got manga in the fridge?
Actually, I can probably turn the camera somehow. Let's see.
What are some of the prized possessions, man? What are some of the, like, we're fans of manga, but we sort of only know the work that was translated here in English. So I plan on going to Japan. Oh yeah, oh yeah, there it is, man.
I can't tell. Maybe this is reversed. Which way?
That was good. We saw it. It was beautiful.
Okay, yeah.
So I want to go to Japan once a year. And I have plenty of room, so I want to grab a lot of stuff. Kaze Shinobu was my big discovery this last trip. The Ryu, Strongest Man on Earth, or whatever. The other one that collected his smaller, like, Drew Lay type strips. Give us some names and give us some manga, because I don't have a pen on me right now, but I'm gonna pause this and write names down and scoop these books up next time I head over there, man.
Yeah, I mean, I don't try and follow all the latest things anymore. I basically just follow whatever I'm interested in.
Sure.
But I'm a big fan of Taiyo Matsumoto. He's got some works that have been translated into into English in the U.S. and such as I think it's called Black and White.
Yes.
In Japanese, it's Tekkon Kinkrit, which is a pun on the word concrete.
I think he has a ping pong sports manga that I've been chasing for years, and I've bought some of the Japanese volumes because it hasn't been translated, and it's coming out in English later this year.
Oh,
so I'm
great.
very excited for that. Yeah, he's a favorite.
I'm a big fan of his, and I like artworks, so I'm also interested in how Japanese artists, some of them have incorporated either American or European styles, and Taiyo Matsumoto is very influenced, I think, by bande dessinée, and by French comics in particular. And Otomo was as well. Otomo Uh, he was very influenced, I think, by Mebius. So I'm kind of interested in that angle, and I like good artwork. So I'm a big fan of Taiyo Matsumoto, and I've got a lot of manga that I'm collecting here that I haven't read that I'm fascinated by. But I'm not the guy to go to for the latest, most commercial sort of things, because I tend to focus on more weird, exotic stuff.
That's what our channel's all about. Like it's not about it's not about the new volume of One Piece or something, man. It's like Kaze Shinobu, like I said, man.
Yeah, let's see.
Oh yeah. He's grabbing the archives, Jimmy. What could it be? I wish we could zoom in on that shelf, man.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This is Taiyo Matsumoto. This is, I don't know if you can see this one, but he can draw in all kinds of different styles, which is really unusual. Most artists can only draw in one style, so that was interesting. On the Japan International Manga Award Executive Committee, there's another member who's an artist herself, Ippon Ibanga, and she just gave me these books on dogs, because she said she's created this dog character, and this whole series, there's 2 volumes about dogs, and actually she told me to publicize it. So can you see this?
Yeah, hold it up a little higher, and then move it closer to where your bookshelf is. There it is. A little bit more.
All right.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what, Fred?
Yeah.
Question. You see on volume 2, there's that guy with the unibrow on the bottom there.
Oh yeah.
Now in Shonen Jump, there's a manga with that guy, and it hit 200 volumes.
That's right.
But that thing has never come to America. Like, why? Is it just too Japan-centric? Like, they think it's too idiosyncratic for America? Because, like, I would love to read. Like, it lasted 200 volumes for some reason. I want to know about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of it. I mean, a lot of books in Japan will never make it here because they're too Japanese, and another factor being, of course, the size of the thing. But I'm sure.
What is that book? The one the Shonen Jump with that unibrow guy, like, you know what I'm talking about? Like,
the artist is Akimoto, and he's featured here on Ippon Ibangu's book because he's recommending her book. And she wrote this book about using a dog character because she said there's all these books right now that are really popular in Japan about cats, because there's a cat in Japan. So she wanted to do something different about dogs. And his name is Akimoto, and the title of his super duper popular series is really, really long, and I can't remember the whole thing right now, but it's something like Katsushika something about the policeman and his beat in this one area of Tokyo. And he's extraordinarily popular, but there's a lot of Japanese manga that will probably never come over here. This is another great artist, Okazaki Kyoko. Can you see this one?
Yeah, yes. Is that shoujo?
No. Well, this is more like a kind of Garo line, but she's very influential and quite popular.
Gorgeous.
She's not around anymore.
Fred, is this all the stuff you got just from your last trip to Japan?
No, this is stuff that my friend sent me. I think this has already appeared in the States. I was amazed that this was published. It's called Ichi-F. It's about Fukushima.
I think we have something called Fukushima Devilfish.
I think it's a different title, but
was it drawn in the 80s?
No. This is after Fukushima. So this is about the disaster, about working at Fukushima in trying to repair the nuclear power plants and that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah.
And this is available in English, and I think it's called Ichi-F or 1F or something like that. It's by Tatsuya Kazuto. And then
this is great, Jimmy.
This is a book. It'll probably never be translated into English, but I haven't even read the whole thing, but I'm looking forward to it because it's a subject I'm really interested in. This is called Kori no Te. Can you see?
Yes.
The Frozen Hand. And it's about, after World War II, a lot of Japanese who were in Manchuria were captured by the Russians and sent to Siberia. And they wound up working in Siberia for a long time. So it's a book about that. And this is by Ozawa Yuki. Can you see?
Yep.
Let's see. So there's all kinds of stuff. There's great stuff. And a lot of it's not that commercial. Just like gag stuff, this is a pig story, little pig story. It's cool.
I brought over 100 tankobon back from my trip, man. Two giant suitcases filled to the brim to their maximum weight capacity.
How do you do that? I mean, do you have a container, or what do you do?
Two of the biggest kinds of the luggage that you could pull, and get every service that you could purchase to deliver the luggage to the airport, almost to the damn airplane. The real trouble is on the connecting flight when you land in Chicago O'Hare, and you have to go through customs all over again with your bags.
Well, you must be drowning in manga, just like I am here.
Oh, I'm sure I don't have half of what you have. That's why we got to ask you for those recommendations, man. Because like that Kaze Shinobu book, like we did a video about it, and it was one of those amazing revelations. Because of course we don't have it here, but if there's a comic where a guy punches through the earth and breaks the earth like a gobstopper, I have to have it in my library, man.
Fred, I had a question on kind of a recent phenomena, or at least in the last couple of decades, of like fans doing translations of manga. Has I think been one avenue that a lot of us have discovered various manga things that haven't been officially translated or published in English, but there are these huge amounts of communities of fans that are doing translations of, I guess, the work that engages them.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, or what is like the Japanese? Is there a Japanese response to that by the publishers? Any backlash or concern or positive reaction to it?
Well, of course, the artists don't like it, and the government doesn't like it. But of course, the irony of it is that scanlation has also contributed to the popularity of manga. So it's this weird situation where you have an illegal enterprise out there in the world, which is enormous, and of course it's draining royalties from the artists and publishers, but at the same time it's helping to increase the popularity of manga. So it's a very weird situation. My thoughts about it are kind of confused, I guess. On one level it's great, on another level it's not. I don't like, if you're a creator, it's a problematic area. I have the same problem, not with manga, but with my own books. I mean, all my books now on Twitter every day, I see somebody advertising, illegal copies of them. So as a creator, it's sort of painful. But in terms of manga and the popularity of manga overseas, they wouldn't be as popular as they are now without scanlation and without bootlegged animation and pirated animation as well. Although the animation thing, I think streaming has sort of rectified some of those issues. But there's a long history of anime in the United States being translated by fans and issues. People copying things illegal and whatnot, and anime never would have become as popular as it has without those fans doing their, fan subs. But from the standpoint of creators, of course, it's painful because they don't get paid for their work.
Yeah, it's sort of like that dojinshi gray zone with a lot of that stuff. I was always here in the States. We had those figures called muscle, Kinnikumen,
Yeah.
and the comic is something I always wanted to read. I always wanted to read the manga, but the manga will never come here because they essentially parody and co-opt a lot of popular American wrestlers in there without, giving the wrestlers any royalty. So it's like they can't bring the comic here because of that. So it has to be scanlated. So it's like the only way that you could read it is through piracy.
Right.
It's sort of unfortunate because if it wasn't, Viz was able to do it, I would buy it. But Ric Flair will have something to say about it, or Hulk Hogan will get upset.
Yeah. Well, I became very aware of the complexity of the whole scanlation issue when I gave a talk once to a manga anime club. I think it was in Wyoming years ago, and I asked people, where do you buy your manga? And listen, there's this silence. And then I realized they told me that they don't have anywhere to buy them. So this is before, I guess, they could have ordered them from Amazon. So they said there's no bookstores, locally, and they don't carry manga if they are, and then we don't have an allowance that's big enough. So that's all they did was they read scanlated works. But they never would have had a manga or anime club without that. So it's a complicated issue, and hopefully, when they became stockbrokers and were, raking in 300,000 a year in IT industries, they would buy a few of the manga if they still like. I don't know. I wanted to go back to, because you asked me about Akimoto's manga that's sold, this just enormous gazillion copies. The title in Japanese is Kochira Katsushikaku Koen Mai Hashusho. It's a really long title. So it's the police station, basically the koban, in front of the Katsushika Ward Kameari Park. And it's known in Japanese because it's so long, everybody calls it Kochikame. So that's probably why it hasn't appeared in English.
Yeah, over the years, I got very few issues of Shonen Jump. My dad would travel overseas, do some work, and then he would come back with an issue or two. And that one was it was ubiquitous, throughout 80s, 90s. So I always was curious about that thing, man.
I have one last thing, Fred, before we wrap up, and I think it's related to the scanlation stuff. The fandom around manga and anime seems so different than the fandom around American comics. From making their own bootleg, illegal scans, or making fan comics of it, or just being, having anime clubs at school. Like, there were no comics clubs at my school, but anime clubs did spring up. And I don't know if you have any insights or thoughts on that, but it does feel like that fandom is just, it's a different culture, it's a different intensity. Any thoughts on that or observations on that?
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating because, of course, the fandom in the United States is totally different from the fandom in Japan when you talk about conventions. Because I've been to a lot of anime conventions in the United States, and they're a totally different thing than like Comiket or the the fanzine conventions that are held in Tokyo. Because they're not, the focus is not on zines. The focus is on community interaction, and especially on cosplay.
Yes.
And the masquerades. So it's a very unique sort of American take on the whole thing, and I enjoy seeing the conventions. It always seems kind of healthy to me. I think because people who are drawn to anime in America, they often, well, maybe not now, but in the beginning at least, they were a little bit eccentric in their own way, and it was a way to come together as a community. And you didn't have to be a certain type of person, and you didn't have to be a man, you didn't have to be male into superheroes. It was so much more diverse because Japanese manga and anime are just so much more diverse to begin with. So, in conventions, when I've been to like Otakon in Baltimore and DC, it always seems like a pretty healthy environment. Although I know there's all kinds of warnings up now at these conventions. Don't do this, don't do that. So obviously they've had problems on their own level, but it's always seemed like a fairly healthy atmosphere for young people, and certainly diverse, and the kind of place that if you were a parent, you probably wouldn't object. I think you wouldn't worry too much about your children attending.
You know what, Fred? This just occurred to me. It's another sort of difference between the American scene and the manga scene, and you might have some real fun insight here in the States, because the artist doesn't typically sell as many units to yield enough royalties to keep the lights on. They have to sell original artwork, but most mangaka, there's not like really an art market in Japan. They keep their is it Genko? Genka?
Yeah.
And you worked with Osamu Tezuka, the guy who made tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 pages. Do you have any insights into how he stored that stuff? I know that some of the shonen manga, like that guy who did the 200-volume Police unibrow comic, like he has a whole house where he, like an apartment where he stores all that stuff. So do the Kinnikuman guys. But do you have any insights into any of mangaka and how they store their art or where they keep it?
Well, most manga artists that I know keep their own work. Tezuka was kind of a early advocate of that. So artists' rights were much more established in Japan than they were in the United States. Going back even to the 60s and 70s. In the case of Tezuka Productions, they have almost all the artwork that Tezuka created. They have a special archives, and an archive, it's huge, and they have not only the work he created, but also the animation and the articles that have been written about him and so forth and so on. Generally, artists have the rights to their work, and they get the work back from the publisher. That may be different with some younger publishers who are part of a different system. It's a senzoku system where they just write for one publisher, and they're kind of captive to that one publisher. But generally, in principle, the artwork reverts to the artist. But there are more collectors in Japan who've emerged. So, for example, Tezuka's work, if you have original Tezuka artwork, that brings a lot more money than it did 20 or 30 years ago. And the market in Japan is nowhere near the US for old manga, but it's growing. And old manga are much harder to acquire now than they would have been before.
There was a guy who I was talking to. He's a publisher out there, and he, I think he got a hold of maybe Tatsumi's work, or he knew somebody who had Tatsumi's work, and his idea was to take it to Angoulême because he might be able to get like $500 a page or something. And I'm like, you might want to ask around because you might be able to get like far more for this stuff. It's like they didn't even know how to price this stuff, and I just thought that was very, very interesting.
Well, I think the collector market in the United States kind of got out of hand, and in a way it may have jeopardized the mainstream superhero industry, at least because people were buying, especially in the late 80s and maybe even the early 90s, there were too many people who were buying superhero comics just as a collector and not even reading them. They're putting them in their vinyl envelopes, putting them in the back of their drawer and hoping that they would become fabulously valuable 10 years later. And I don't think that was good for the U.S. comics industry. So, in a sense, manga in Japan have been much more of a, until recently at least, a very living, breathing art medium than at least mainstream superhero comics were in the United States for a while. But that's just my own take on it.
So this global catastrophe clears up, and Eddie P gets a ticket to go to Japan. where should I go on my manga hunt to to get interesting weird stuff?
Well, I think you've already been to Mandarake, right? Mandarake is not bad for used comics. There's one in Shibuya, and I think one in Nakano still. I was really disappointed to see that the Takano, I think it's Takano Shoten, which is a really old classic manga store in Jimbocho, which is the bookstore area of Tokyo, that's actually going out of business, or just went out of business. That was kind of crushing because that was in existence for a long time. But I think, if you want obscure stuff, that Mandarake is not a bad place to go. You can get secondhand stuff as well as new stuff. And then Book Off, there are these Book Off discount stores. You can find a lot of manga there. But Japan is changing, and we think of Japan as this just enormous unique manga market. But when I go to Japan now, I very rarely see people reading manga. And I know that people will tell you that, everybody's reading manga on their cell phones. But actually, if you look on the subways now and on the trains, most people are not reading manga. They're playing games on their smartphones. So I really don't know how some of the publishers are staying in business, because there are big changes going on in Japan.
I visited Jimbocho, and I went to Shueisha and Kodansha, and visited Young Magazine, Shonen Jump. They said that the print numbers are down, but the subscriptions for digital have sort of kept things at an equilibrium with where they were when they were like almost most popular. So they'll do like 4 million copies a week of Shonen Jump, but most of them are digital, which I thought was interesting. But Jimbocho is awesome. For the Kayfabe viewer out there who's going to Japan, there's that strip in Jimbocho that has all sorts of old books and magazines, and you could find 100 yen Garos from like the Primo era.
And nothing beats paper. Paper's good,
No, yeah, that's how I rule, man. Fred, I don't want to keep you too much longer. Jimmy, you have any others?
No, I don't.
You're very generous with your time. I was about to call you sir.
It's been great talking with you guys, and stay safe and all that. Read lots of comics and keep up the great work. It's I decided that your way of reviewing and introducing books and manga and comics, it's great. It's new to me, but it's fabulous.
It's new to us too.
Yes.
And one of the things I don't want to leave without doing is getting some Frederik L. Schodt plugs out there. So can you let people know where they could find you on Twitter, any sort of social media, any websites? And I'll certainly put links in the description as well, so that people can hit you up with one click, or visit your site in one click.
I have my own website. It's pretty static. It's Jai2, Jai2.com. And I'm on Twitter. I'm FSCHODT on Twitter. I have a public Facebook page, which is the most confusing wording of anything I know. It's a public page, and I forget what it is. I think it's just Fred Schodt, something like that. But I'm out there. I'm not on Instagram. I probably should be, but I'm on enough stuff. I'm on LinkedIn. There's enough stuff out there.
If you do grab an Instagram account, let's see those bookshelves up close, man. Let's take a couple pictures of these bookshelves. Let's see the garage. We don't need to see details. Just the books. Just the books. Let me see what's in that collection.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do it. Yes.
It was a pleasure, sir.
Yeah, pleasure talking to you. Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye. Good luck.
Thanks, Fred.